Non, au provincial, hein, parce que tu sais c'est quoi? Alors, je déclare la séance ouverte.
Good morning, everyone. We'll begin our meeting, and thank you all for being here for our meeting. This morning, we have the pleasure of welcoming the Honorable David Emerson, who has kindly agreed to accept our invitation. Thank you, Mr. Emerson, for being here to answer the questions of members this morning. We will also hear from Mr. Murad Al-Khatib via video conference directly from Regina, Saskatchewan. Good morning, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, sans plus tarder...
So without much further ado, for his opening statement, I will now give the floor to the Honorable David Emerson.
Honorable members, it's really good to be here, and I have to say that the report that we're really focused on today was initiated nearly 2 years ago and was submitted to the Minister of Transport about 8 months ago. And so for me, I've had lots of soak time or gestation time to reflect, and I've intentionally stayed away from the media, and I've stayed away from conferences and symposia because I really did want to not become the object of the report, as it were. I wanted the report to be debated as a document of substance. And if I can say so, while many people refer to it as the Emerson Report, it is actually not the Emerson Report. There was a 5-person advisory panel that worked with me. I chaired the panel, and Murad Al-Khatib was one of the experts on the panel. He has a deep knowledge of of the agricultural sectors in Canada. We also had on the panel Duncan Dee, who was a former senior executive at Air Canada, Marcella Zale, who was a former senior executive at CP Rail, Marie-Lucie Morin, who is actually in the back of the room today, who was my former deputy minister when I was in Trade and Foreign Affairs, and David Cardan, who was a senior executive with Maersk, the largest shipping company in the world. And the report was really intended to look out 25 to 30 years. It's not intended to be a micro here and now to-do list, but what we have tried to do is place Canada in the context of some of the major geopolitical forces that will affect our country and our economy over the next few decades, and ask the question, what do we need to be doing today to be ready to be globally competitive and economically successful 2 or 3 decades out? And I can tell you, 2 or 3 decades is not a long time in the world of transportation. Most of you will be all too familiar with infrastructure projects that are in the planning stages and approval stages for sometimes multiple decades, or until they die, whichever comes first. Usually they die, as we saw with the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, and the same with regulation. When one is changing regulation in the transportation sector, you really have to be looking out at a very, very long-term perspective in order to enable what is a very, very complex transportation system to adjust to any changes that are material in terms of policy and regulation. I would really just focus on the emphasis in the report. There's a couple of things I would note rather than take you through any detail. The first is that we have attempted, as I've already suggested, to link transportation issues and transportation policy, regulation, and so on to the Canadian economy, and the linkage is through trade. Transportation has now, in my opinion, become actually more important to trade success than trade policy, because in reality there is so much international investment that allows commercial footprints to span the globe, and tariffs have been relatively low these days, that transportation actually is a larger component of overall cost structures than almost anything you can think of on the trade front. And so if you get transportation right, that will be the number one way to ensure the competitiveness of the country going forward. So linkage to trade and economic success. Of course, transportation is the glue that in many respects binds the country together. We are a hugely expansive country with a thin population spread between three oceans, and transportation is absolutely critical to the unity and cohesion of the country. And so transportation is vital to the national character, if you like. And I will say that rather than pointing to a specific recommendation, I believe that the most important thing for the government to do is get decision-making right. And that's why I urge you to pay close attention to the chapter on governance, because governance is all about decision-making, from big policy decision-making that has to span all of government right down to the minutiae of regulatory decision-making that you have to get right. It has to be in real time, and it has to be extremely well informed by good information. And so, yes, we have individual recommendations throughout the report, but if you don't get governance right, you're really not doing very much. You're playing around at the edges. So with that, I will rest my case and respond to questions, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Emerson. Tout d'abord,
Thank you very much, Mr. Emerson. I wanted to thank you and your team for the outstanding work you did in drafting this report and for all the time you spent on the report. I believe that committee members were very much looking forward to hearing from you. Just a note for the MPs who are here today. We will examine two issues this morning, and there's no specific order in which we should address them. We have 2 hours with Mr. Emerson. We can go from one subject to the other. This is what we agreed to with the clerk. So please don't hesitate. There won't be a second presentation by Mr. Emerson. We want to have a free-flowing discussion with Mr. Emerson during the 2 hours he is with us. So, first round of questions, Ms. Kelly Block.
I appreciate this opportunity to have this dialogue with you, Mr. Emerson, and I want to welcome you to the committee. I know that a focus of the report that we are in right now is around interswitching, so I'm going to start with some of my questions around interswitching. And I know that on page 165 of the report, the review recommends that the Government of Canada allow the extended 160-kilometer interswitching limits to sunset. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. This is the second day of our study, And we've heard from some producers, and I've heard from individuals since the report was made public in my riding, which is a very large rural riding, that they are concerned that that was a recommendation within this report, specifically because, I guess, because of the changing landscape in the prairies when it comes to the number of places where you can load your grain or unload. And so I'm wondering, one of the members from the CTA on Tuesday stated that interswitching is a tool used to address a market failure. So my first question is, would you define what happened in 2013 as a market failure, or just simply, you know, a number of extraordinary events coming together to create the pressure that we saw in the prairies when it came to moving grain? And then secondly, maybe comment on the changing landscape, and then why you thought it appropriate to recommend that length of interswitching be sunsetted.
Thank you very much for that question. I take you back to the foundation upon which we developed our thinking on transportation issues, and that was to look out 25 to 30 years. The interswitching debate is really a very narrow debate, because interswitching, as you know, applies only to certain provinces. It only applies to grain. It is an attempt to add a dimension of competition into a system which, to be very blunt, is rife with power imbalances between major service providers, small shippers. Throughout the transportation system, not just in rail, there are an enormous range of issues that involve near monopolies or natural monopolies, as they're referred to. And so you do get a tremendous amount of friction in the system that results from power imbalances between service providers and their customers. So interswitching is one small tool to help the agricultural sector around that. Our view was that yes, we should have provisions for interswitching, but over time, and I'm talking over decades, we really should be not just focusing on interswitching as it relates to grain or as it relates to three provinces. We need to look at interswitching in a larger sense, and part of the recommendations of the report call for a remandating of the Canadian Transportation Agency and a sort of enhanced resource base for the agency, so that the agency could make determinations across a whole range of shippers that feel that they are disadvantaged by their local situation or their local service provider, and give the agency the flexibility to mandate interswitching. And it could be 160, it could be more than that or less than that, and ideally it should probably cover other commodities as well. And so our view was that the 160 is arbitrary. It's narrow in terms of public policy considerations going forward, and it should be broadened.
Thank you very much. I know from reading I guess, the piece of legislation, C30, that it's my understanding that interswitching can be applied to other commodities and take into account the various regions across the country. It's my understanding that there are various rates also contemplated. You know, interswitching goes back to 1904, started with a 4-mile distance, and now there are a number of distances contemplated. If if 92% of producers now have access at the 160-kilometer distance for interswitching, more than did have before that was implemented, why wouldn't you just keep it in the legislation and then go ahead and contemplate longer distances if that made more sense?
Une courte réponse, s'il vous plaît, Monsieur Emerson.
A brief answer, please, Mr. Emerson.
I don't think it's a big problem to leave it in, to be honest with you, but I do think it's a big problem if there isn't consideration to a longer-term evolution to allow a broader switching capacity going forward. Mr. Khatib is actually our expert on the panel. Murad, do you want to make a quick comment on interswitching?
Je vais demander à Monsieur malheureusement, le temps est écoulé.
Unfortunately, our time is up. Perhaps Mr. Khatib can respond a little later. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Badaway.
Welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you here this morning. I'm going to start off with a question with respect to the role of the federal government, and what role do you think or envision that the federal government should take to ensure that the private sector, municipal, provincial governments, and other stakeholders, customers and passengers, so on and so forth, what role and what steps should be taken and be necessary to ensure that the Canadian transportation system stays globally competitive?
Well, in the report, as I indicated earlier, that there's a whole chapter on governance, and part of the governance improvements would include the establishment of a transportation and logistics advisory council that would incorporate all of the different shipping interests, as well as provincial and local governments represented in some way in terms of kind of an ongoing, well-informed, almost real-time reflection on the transportation system and how it evolves going forward. So I think that is critically important. As I've said earlier, I think a remandated CTA is extremely important. We've been, the transportation system and transportation policy has evolved over the last few decades from very deeply regulated, government-heavy transportation system to one which is very highly market-oriented these days.
Let's dig down on that a bit more, because that was actually my next question with respect to the CTA.
Okay.
Do you find that the CTA, being a legislated mandate, do you find that as part of that legislated mandate, they can actually include what we're discussing here versus another body?
No, is the short answer. I think that in government there is a lack of a cross-government mechanism where policy in the various departments, whether it's international trade, global affairs, or environment, or environmental issues, or northern issues, there is a need within government for a broader focus on transportation as a key foundation of government economic policy. So I think that has to be beyond the CTA, which is a more restricted regulatory focus. And I do believe that you do need advisory mechanisms that include the various elements of the transportation and logistics system, and I think you need a significant amount of input from financial institutions as well, because to really enable the transportation system to grow and thrive in the future takes way more money than the government can possibly throw at it, and you're going to need the private sector to come to the table, and government is going to have to learn how to enable the private sector to make a bigger contribution.
And with respect to a lot of, how much time do I have, Mr. Chairman? Great. With respect to those investments, and really speaking of or aligning the strategy with infrastructure investments, And you make great mention in the report how important it is to align those infrastructure investments with the transportation strategy. And with that, better returns, better outcomes, and performance measures. When you look at those investments and you look at some of the decisions that this committee is looking at now, do you find that a lot of the decisions may be being made too quick versus coming out with the strategy first and then making those decisions? And what I'm getting at with respect to the interswitching, to sunset it too early may not be to the best advantage of the industry. To look at a strategy first and then sunset it post-strategy, do you find that would be advantageous?
I generally believe that apart from crisis management, which is by its very nature immediate, you're always better off to have a strategy and make your individual decisions within the context of a strategy.
Okay. And with respect to the gateways, you mentioned trade corridors and gateways in your report. Canada, to some extent, in the early part of the century, built a railroad, but never necessarily integrated railroad with water, rail, or water, road, and of course air. Do you find that moving ahead, it's advantageous to begin the process of establishing gateways, establishing trade corridors based on the strengths of the different parts of our country, and then from there making those investments with respect to infrastructure?
There is no doubt in my mind that trade corridors and gateways are critical to the efficiency of the transportation system and the way it supports international trade going forward. And we have, of course, in the report talked extensively about trade corridors and gateways. We've spoken of the need for the Government of Canada to play a leadership role in ensuring, if not the sanctity, at least the durability and preservation of critical transportation and logistics corridors going forward, because urban encroachment and various other disruptions can create bottlenecks and true competitive crises and problems if those corridors are not preserved and enabled to operate fluidly and efficiently.
Great.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Emerson.
Je cède maintenant.
Thank you very much. Mr. Robert Aubin, you have the floor now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Al-Khadib and Mr. Emerson, for being here. It's a real pleasure to be enlightened by yourselves on our study. I'm new to this committee, and in the last few days, I've been reading your report, so please don't hesitate to correct me if I may have misinterpreted some parts of it. So, going from the general to the specific, it seems to me that the entire report was basically based on the fact that our market is already competitive. However, having heard several witnesses, I would question that premise, the premise that our market is already competitive. So, on what basis can you state that Canada's transportation market is already competitive?
Chance to reflect on the report in its entirety. We do not argue that the transportation system is entirely competitive. I alluded in my opening remarks to enormous and numerous power imbalances in the system because of the nature of transportation and the natural monopolies that prevail, whether it's airports or railways or ports. There are some significant elements where competition is really not effective. However, the Canadian economy is a trading economy, one of the most trade-intensive economies in the world, and our transportation systems compete with the transportation systems in the U.S. and other countries. And in that sense, there's a tremendous amount of competition between our railways and American railways, between our ports and American ports, between our airports and American ports, our airlines. So even if, for example, Air Canada is in an oligopoly situation in Canada, it's in a highly competitive international market. So you have a combination of micro competitive imbalances with macro competitive forces that are actually very strong.
Merci. Vous avez parlé dans une question
Thank you. In answer to a previous question, you talked about the importance of private sector investment. You even include percentages in your report and also talk about foreign investment in our sector, including airports. But in the next 25 years, something will not change. That's our geography. Canada's a huge country. We have a lot of isolated countries, for instance, in the north. So if we open the door to the private sector to try to connect all of these places, how do we ensure that the more isolated regions will have the same services, even though they might be less profitable?
Comment, actually. The report is actually quite emphatic that isolated communities with particular reference to the north will not be served effectively by free market competition. The distances are huge. The passenger loads are very thin or small. The ability to finance transportation infrastructure in isolated communities is just not there. You won't get private investment. And so we are quite emphatic that government must play a much bigger role, particularly in some of the more remote parts of the country. So I don't know if that answers your question, but in reference to more private sector investment in major transportation facilities, we have called for the advisability of allowing institutional investors, not public markets, but institutional investors to play a bigger role in financing airports and ports, for example. We believe that can be done with government guidelines and contracts and arrangements that would actually enable massive amounts of long-term stable money to flow into Canadian infrastructure. And in fact, the case is doing that in Quebec, as you know.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il me reste une minute?
Thank you. Do I have a minute left, Mr. Chairman? If so, I would like to give that time to Mr. Al-Khatib to respond to my colleague's question.
Which question?
Sur
Interswitching issue. Give them your 30-second elevator talk.
Yeah, sure, I will. On interswitching, I think that a very important consideration is during the deliberations, we had very, limited, ability to pull examples of actual utilization, of the interswitching provisions that were extended out to 160 kilometers. That being said, when we do look at it as, kind of a post-report reflection, shippers don't agree that the infrequent use of that provision, makes the feature of the regulatory regime with limited effectiveness or impact. The measure of success of interswitching, in the eyes of many shippers, is how it actually creates that competitive force. I think that, one of the things that we have to be very clear on is industry, took that recommendation that we thought interswitching was not important. What we recommended was sunsetting the 160 kilometers, putting it back into the hands of the agency to allow them to determine the appropriate distances in the appropriate cases. And I think that, this is where Mr. Emerson is referring to, a cohesive, mandate and strategy around utilization of that as a competitive measure provision. So I think that that's, important. We do recognize the importance of it. It's the methodology. The arbitrary nature of the 160 was really much more what we were commenting on.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Al-Khatib. Je cède maintenant la parole à Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Khatib. Mr. Yakanov. Good morning, Honorable Mr. Emerson and Mr. Al-Khatib. Mr. Chairman, I will share my time with my colleague, Mr. Sean Fraser. Mr. Emerson, I have a few questions about your report. With regard to grain transportation, your report says that the grain handling system and transportation system should not be over-regulated. The roles and obligations must be defined clearly. Obligations and roles of whom? The rail companies? Farmers? How do you define roles clearly without bringing in regulation?
Quite emphatic that the transportation system, first off, is a system. It's a very complex system with many moving parts, many different companies and players involved. The grain system is no different. On the grain side, we argue in the report that we need to have a forum or a mechanism in which all of the different interests in the agricultural or grain community can come together: the railways, the grain company, the ports, the shipping companies, the farmers, because you need them all around the table thinking long term and basically equipped with much better information, more reliable information than they now have, to ensure that there is an ongoing tracking of priorities and anticipation of potential bottlenecks. For example, the 2013-14 grain crisis could have largely been avoided if everybody in the system had all of the information that somebody else had, and if it were pooled together and used for anticipatory decision making at that time. But the system is fragmented, decision making is fragmented, and you got the crisis that we had. Murad, you're the expert.
To add, I think that one of the very key foundational elements of the recommendation related to roles, responsibilities in a commercial system is adequate information, powers of the agency to be able to investigate and act on its own accord to examine systemic issues within the transportation system. Today, the CTA is entirely reactive to a complaint. We think a legislative regulatory body should be able to investigate. And then dispute resolution mechanisms are really the key element. If we put in place dispute resolution mechanisms that function appropriately, then you then encourage commercial solutions. So service level agreements between railways and shippers is a means in which regulation can encourage the commercial outcome. Things like reciprocal financial consequences. If a railway has a right to charge demurrage, a shipper should have the right to charge for their failure. So, the term reciprocity is used in our report, and that has to be interpreted very clearly as reciprocal rights to enable the imbalance in power to be able to be solved through commercial contracts. And I think that that's, the point of not over-regulating. Because, over-regulation, I've used the term very clearly in our consultations. Be careful, over-regulation can in fact cripple the system and make us very, very inefficient.
Monsieur Fraser, pour 2 minutes.
You have some time left, sir.
On the interswitching issue, some of the comments that I've heard from Mr. Emerson earlier were that potentially leaving it as it is in the short term wouldn't be that big a deal as long as we have a plan to deal with the issue in the long term. We did hear from producers during our last meeting essentially that there would be some short-term pain, not because they're using it so much now, but because it's created commercial conditions that more or less create competition in the marketplace. Do you think if we prematurely let this sunset that the producers' fear would be realized and we'd be doing ourselves a disservice?
Well, just remember, even sunsetting doesn't take it out of the hands of the agency. The agency still has the right to set the interswitching distances. So sunsetting doesn't mean you're getting rid of interswitching provisions at all. That being said, 160 kilometers, 30 kilometers, which was more the norm in the Act implementation previously. Really, again, we want to make it very clear. That's an arbitrary number. You could have taken 160, or you could have made it 250 or 150. So, the leaving of 160, I think, is not the big issue. I think the issue needs to be studied. I think one thing that we have to give as the balancing view is, there was a strong view by the railways that interswitching provisions do expose them to undue competition from U.S. railways coming into Canada without a reciprocal right on the other end for them to go into the United States and have the ability to compete. And so, there was that, balancing provision that, I think we do have to always consider the regulation on both sides. It does open it up to processors, but it certainly does put our railways into a undue competition scenario with their U.S. counterparts.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, is there any remaining time?
Non.
Okay, thank you.
Désolé. Je laisse maintenant la parole.
No, sorry about that. Mr. Sikan now for 6 minutes.
Panel heard that 94% of the grain is transported using rail. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's in the current regime it would be by rail today, yes, but that is changing, and containers are becoming much more prevalent.
Okay. Bearing in mind how you mentioned the interplay between trade and transportation, would you say there's a viable mode of transportation out there that we could utilize other than rail?
No.
Okay.
I think what is clear, and it's articulated in the report, that Canadian agriculture in particular, but I would also argue that Canadian bulk cargo travels a longer distance to get to Tidewater than in most other competing jurisdictions like Australia or the U.S. or elsewhere. And so rail is going to continue for the foreseeable future to be a critical catalyst for and support of the Canadian economy going forward, particularly on the bulk side, but also for intermodal container
And
traffic.
then, just keeping that in mind as well, would it be conceivable or even possible to consider laying down an entire new rail system or structure?
It's always possible. The question is money, and having the corridor of the land to do it. And we actually gave some radical thought to really dramatically different models of building and operating railways, and we looked around the world at different countries and the way they do it, and really came away with the view that the Canadian Class 1 rail system is really one of the best in the world. It's we all complain about Hunter Harrison and getting his operating ratios down and sweating the assets and not having enough resilience in the system and so on. But the truth of the matter is the Canadian Class 1 rail system is an extremely efficient system, and for us to kind of undo the efficiencies that have been gained would be bad for the Canadian economy. What we believe needs to be focused on is not so much government helping the Class 1s, but government creating an environment in which the feeder systems are much more fluid and much more competitive and efficient, because in a world where high-speed, high-volume corridors, whether they're on the rails or in the air, are really the backbone of the transportation system, you get a world where if it's that first and last mile, small communities need to be better connected to the high-speed, high-volume corridors. So short-line rail and trucking really needs to be supported strongly so that the feeder systems from remote areas that are not right on the main line have access to it.
Okay. How much time do I have left?
2 minutes and a half.
Of tons of additional capacity to use intermodal containers, and also the hopper car fleet is aging dramatically. To replace the hopper car fleet with high cube cars, we can create 5 to 8 million tons of additional capacity just on the existing rail system, by utilizing the current corridors. We've got tens of millions of tons of additional capacity just by utilizing better what we have.
Thank you for that. I'm going to switch gears here because now that we have you here. In regards to aerospace, seeing as a lot of Asian countries are now becoming more innovative, how do we continue to be a dominant player in that aerospace sector? I know it's a broad question.
Well, aerospace is a whole separate report that I was involved in a couple of years ago. I guess I'd just make a couple of comments. One is we need to continue to make it a national industrial priority. I think space in particular, Canada has been a leader in space for decades. I think we have dropped the ball a bit and we have lost our sense of a long-term strategy. We've lost the commitment to substantive long-term funding. And without that, an important enabler of the economy and an important enabler of northern development and development in isolated areas, security, and so on, is really to be found in the space sector. So space is critical. Government procurement is critical. And we have made recommendations in the past for better programming in terms of support for aerospace.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Je cède maintenant.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Ms. Deanne Watts.
Being here, good to see you. David, I want to talk about trade corridors, and specifically in our neck of the woods and in Metro Vancouver. Now, in the report, we're talking about governance and how you said it was extremely important, which I couldn't agree more, because I think where there's so much conflict is when you have so many different organizations that have a piece of something. And whether you're looking at Port Metro or Metro Vancouver, or you've got 3 levels of government, and they can be at cross purposes with one another, and also too that cross-ministerial cooperation, not only federally but provincially as well. And I mean, I think we're seeing a lot play out right now with the municipalities and Port Metro at loggerheads because of the land that's needed to preserve some of the economic activity. So my question is, given all that, I would expect that it would be frustrating for you. And I know they set up the Asia Pacific Gateway Group and tried to bring everybody together, but it still hasn't solidified in terms of how we can better advantage all of those elements along that corridor. So what would be your advice in terms of looking at it holistically 10, 20, 30 years down the road and making it all work? Because in all of those elements, I mean, right there, close to the expansion of T2 is second largest border crossing in the country that carries millions of dollars worth of goods, billions back and forth with the U.S. trucking, that doesn't play a feature in that whole corridor. So how do we get past all of that?
I think the short answer is money. And the long answer is when I was in government, I was Minister for International Trade with added responsibility for the Asia Pacific Gateways and Corridors Initiative. And in our report, we have noted that other countries in the world looked at what we did there, which was to integrate transportation trade-related corridors, and infrastructure decision-making was driven by the merits of the investment for the trade corridor. It wasn't, building ice rinks in politically marginal ridings or anything. It was what investments are actually going to improve Canada's trade performance, and that was the guiding factor. And we have recommended in the report that there be a very close collaboration between the Minister of Transportation and the Minister of, I don't know what it's called today. It used to be called International Trade, DFA. There needs to be close collaboration between those ministers, in particular around infrastructure planning, trade policy integration with transportation planning and vice versa. And then there needs to be the provincial municipal loop through this advisory council that we've talked about on transportation and logistics.
Right. And I think that model, I mean, it's a good model that will work. It's a matter of getting everybody on the same page going the same way in terms of, there's different agendas that sometimes at the municipal level. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of governance, I mean, that body would have to have some significant political will and authority in terms of making all of those decisions all the way down the line.
Yeah, my view is that that body would be mandated under a revised Canada Transportation Act, and that there would be a Canadian transportation and logistics strategy that would be evergreen, rather than the decennial review that we've just undertaken.
Yeah.
There should be virtually an ongoing, at least annual review. But first, you need a strategy to review. And so you need to develop a strategy. And I think federal infrastructure funding can be used to essentially leverage local decision-making to make the decisions that are good for the national system and good for the local community.
Right.
But money does it. Money gives you the leverage. The strategy gives you the guideposts.
And I think that's probably more advantageous when you have that model put into actual legislation. And then I think that's where you get your,
C'est fini.
Your time is up. Thank you very much. Mr. Hardy, you have the floor.
Mr. Emerson and Mr. Al-Khatib. I want to focus back on C-30, which was something that was brought along due to some extraordinary circumstances. And we were warned that actually those circumstances haven't gone away. Our crops are continually improving, and who knows what the weather is going to deal us. So I wanted to focus at first on that, and then perhaps later in this session I want to come back to some broader issues that you addressed in your report. A couple of things. Interswitching, what I understand is that there's no big problem if we leave it at 160 for a while. We need something longer term or a longer term strategy to migrate to something else.
That's a fair comment, although I don't like the idea, because there are other shippers out there who have an equally legitimate claim for special treatment, and they're not getting it.
Okay, fair enough. And then reciprocal obligations, if you will. Certainly in the people that have come to my office, they've said, look, if I'm late loading the cars, I pay a penalty. If the shipper's late in having the ship pick up from the cars, they pay a penalty. But if the railways are late delivering those cars, big deal. You are recommending, though, that there be some reciprocal balanced obligations between all the players?
Yes, and I'll let Murad, who's an expert on this, speak to that.
We recommended, very clearly that service level agreements, the shipper should have the right, within the definition of operational terms, that reciprocity shall govern operational terms. And for absolute clarity, reciprocity would include reciprocal financial consequences as a right of a shipper under a service level agreement that may be arbitrated by the Canada Transportation Agency if the parties cannot come to a commercially negotiated agreement.
Great, thank you for that. Interswitching itself, does that impose any difficulties on the railways, either operationally or cost-wise?
The answer is yes.
The way that interswitching revenues are treated today, they are actually counted against the maximum revenue entitlement. And one of our recommendations on the modernization of the maximum revenue entitlement was to allow railways to be fairly compensated for their interswitching and for those revenues to be excluded from their maximum revenue entitlement. In essence, the revenue counts, but the move itself doesn't count. So really the railways are penalized for interswitching. They're obligated to do it, so I think that when you consider the interswitching, you have to consider how that revenue is accounted for to make sure that the railways aren't penalized for it.
So the revenue they get, it counts against their maximum revenue entitlement, but the move doesn't count toward their obligation to move a set amount of grain? Is that what?
That's right. And so in a way, the way that the calculation, the way that the agency treats it under the legislation today, removing that interswitching, as other income that doesn't count against their maximum, revenue that they can earn, I think is a recommendation that has some merit to take a look at. And that won't penalize the producers who are really requiring or wanting to have the interswitching. I think it's a fair balance.
Okay. I wanted to get to the maximum revenue entitlements. Briefly, can you, I gather that that's obviously meant to suppress rates, to keep rates more affordable for grain producers and shippers. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. Other than obviously taking away from the free market level at which things would be charged, are there other distortions that the MRE creates in the system?
If you sit down, I was also responsible for Mr. Emerson for potash and a number of other commodities. And if we look at, other commodities, forestry products, potash, the rest of them, they're dealing in a market-based system. In a way, they feel that they're subsidizing the grain shipping. And so from that perspective, there is a distortion from that. The other distortion that happens today is that, new modes of transport, we mentioned containerized grain. We recommended that be excluded from the MRE, as a result of the fact that it really wasn't intended to be captured there. There was no containerized movement of grain when the MRE concept came in. It costs railways more to move containers, so therefore they're being penalized under an MRE system, and really they're not incented to make that capacity available. I believe that's a major part of our future capacity creation, so that when we have crops that are unexpectedly large, containerized movements can happen. The other thing we have in the MRE that distorts is what we call the free rider rights. If one railway makes an investment and the other railway makes less of an investment, they actually equalize the investment. So if CN makes a bigger investment than CP, CP gets half of CN's investment. So, the free rider rights really are not, very fair, and they don't incent investment. So these are all the things that I think are problematic. Rates is one thing, but the MRE does create a number of other problems.
I think my time is up, but I hope I get another round because I have more questions. Thank you.
Nous en aurons une, Monsieur Hardy.
Sure, Mr. Hardy. We'll have a second round. The next 5 minutes go to the official opposition. Normally, I'm on that side, so I'll ask a question to Mr. Emerson. Sir, you said that that Canada's Class 1 rail system is one of the best in the world. Railways linking smaller communities to one of the best in the world is probably number 250 in the world. So in my region, there's a lot of pressure on local communities to convert rail lines into cycling lanes. What do you think about this trend in more isolated areas? If you have a message to send to those communities, what would you tell them? What would you tell them about this trend we're seeing not only in Quebec but in many other communities where, again, there's pressure to convert rail beds into cycling paths?
I would say that we should move very, very cautiously in terms of abandoning track. And I'm thinking mainly of rural feeder lines or feeder lines that connect to resource regions and that kind of thing. The issue of abandonment of lines within urban areas, I think that's a local issue for local people. In Vancouver, they've just converted a major old line that really didn't have much economic relevance to, you said it, bike lanes and gardens and that kind of thing. So I don't want to come out and make a blanket statement that no line should ever be converted, but I think it should be more difficult to abandon lines, because I think over the next 10 or 20 years, a lot of the lines that we may have abandoned now or 10 years ago will want back because of what you have alluded to, which is the need for short line capacity to feed the system.
Quel devrait être le rôle?
What should be the role of regulatory agencies and governments when it comes to preserving our rail network?
Je pense que Mourad voulait dire quelque chose.
Monsieur Al-Khatib?
I just wanted to make one quick point. The cost of relaying those tracks is very, very prohibitive. So, I think that, as Mr. Emerson said, the infrastructure replacement 10 years down the road, if you make a mistake, it's so prohibitive that it'll never get redone. So you do have to be very, very careful. Municipalities, when they're considering it, need to consider that replacement cost. Most short-line railway beds in Canada would never be laid again if they were to be laid. So from that perspective, they're very valuable assets.
We have recommendations in the report on short line and the need to have better tax treatment of investment in short line rail related assets to bring it up to the same standard that they have in the United States. They've got far superior legislation and tax provisions in the U.S. for their short line rail system. And as I've said and you've acknowledged, the short line system is going to play an increasingly important role because you cannot efficiently have the level or the Class 1 railways taking on all of the feeder responsibilities that are going to be necessary to ensure the vibrance of smaller, more remote communities.
Dans ma communauté à Lac-Mégantic,
in my community of Lac-Mégantic, we've suffered the consequences of weakening the maintenance of tracks, especially short line tracks. But what you're telling us is that these short lines are extremely important given the world economy and Canada's role in it.
Je vais me couper moi-même.
Thank you very much. I'll cut myself off here. My time is up. And now for 3 minutes, Mr. Aubin. Thank you very much. 2 brief questions. First, on passenger rail in my municipality, which I have the honor of representing, there has not been any passenger rail service for decades. And I'm talking about Trois-Rivières, which is not an isolated area. What do we need to do to get back rail service? Do we need government to invest, or will market forces one day service an area like Trois-Rivières?
Our recommendations in the report were over the next few decades to allow VIA, for example, to invest in its own roadbed. One of the real barriers to an efficient passenger rail system is the requirement to use the same tracks as the freight trains are using, which creates scheduling issues and reliability issues and basically crowding each other on the same track, probably safety issues as well. We think that government can, perhaps through public-private partnerships or providing the right regulatory and investment incentives, can play an important role in enabling the private sector to invest more in passenger rail. It's a high-density urban future. It's not a future, in our view, that will take off in terms of long-distance passenger rail. It's simply not going to happen. It's uneconomic, and to the degree it does happen on a long distance, it tends to be tourism-related. So government needs to play a bigger role, but in the high-density regions.
Merci. Sur un autre.
Thank you. On another subject, still in Trois-Rivières, when we talk about grain transportation, a lot of it is done by rail, but we also talk about marine transport and the effectiveness of our grain. Marine transportation is well known. You seem to be saying that repatriating the Coast Guard within Transport Canada would be advantageous when it comes to maritime transportation. Can you expand on that?
We took the view in the report that the Coast Guard is under-resourced and under-mandated, almost tragically so, that it's basically not able to meet its responsibilities in terms of what it was originally envisaged to do. Our ice-breaking capacity is abysmal. Our investment in hydrographics and a number of the other marine-related navigational tools is abysmal. And so the Coast Guard needs a reboot, in our view. We felt that it was better positioned in transport than in fisheries because it really is a vital element, supporting element of the transportation system. Yes, it has relevance to fisheries, but it's much more core to transportation.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Emerson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Emerson. 3 minutes is not very long, so we're finished with our first round, our first meeting with Mr. Emerson. And we will now start the second round, and we will begin again with 6 minutes. And I will give the floor to Ms. Kelly Block.
Well, I'm extremely grateful for the fact that we are continuing on with our discussion with you, Mr. Emerson. As we've gone through an hour of testimony, I just have numerous questions that have arisen, not only from your answers, but from questions and comments that my colleagues have been making. I do want to follow up on the comment that you made in regards to the unfairness that perhaps is perceived or actually created in the system as a result of the interswitching provisions that were put in for our grain farmers in C30. And I guess one of the questions I have, and Mr. Khatib or yourself could answer it, is there an issue of timeliness when moving grain or other cereal commodities that needs to, other cereal crops that need to be taken into consideration as opposed to other commodities?
I think the answer is yes, and Murad can add to it. I would just make the general comment that the Canadian transportation system, particularly for grain, has less off-farm storage capacity than other countries and relies much more heavily on a just-in-time transportation system to ensure a continuous, smooth flow of product to market. So that's a really important factor. And when the evolution of the railways to becoming much more efficient, high volume, high speed, sort of mainline systems has meant that there is very little in terms of spare capacity in the rail system. And so some thought needs to be given, and Murad can maybe shed some more light on it, in terms of how we ensure that there is surge capacity available in the system.
I mean, certainly the desire of producers is to move the crop at harvest time, September, October, November, December, January. This is the traditional shipping period for the Canadian crop. All that being said, I think that the grain industry, we have to do a better job, and I'm a part of that industry, that we have to utilize both the west and the east corridors. We have to market to a year-round program. When we have a variability that's unforeseen because of positive weather, where you can end up with 10 to 15 million tons of additional production that no one predicts because of Mother Nature, you cannot move all of the crop in 4 to 5 months, even though producers want it to be moved. And, to your colleague's comment earlier about Trois-Rivières, the utilization of the lakes and the seaway more effectively with ice-breaking capacity to make it more year-round, the utilization of Prince Rupert, the utilization of containers. One of your previous witnesses said it's not a viable option. We move more containers out of Canada than any other grain shipper, and I can tell you that that's part of the major solution, is the empty containers going back to Asia, coming into the U.S. via Prince Rupert and Vancouver. And so from that perspective, I think we have to utilize all the assets, and farmers have to recognize we have to market a crop in a whole year.
Thank you. I think this confirms the comments of my colleague when he speaks to the need for a strategy before we start looking at individual issues within our transportation system. At our last meeting, we heard from the CTA that they determine the regulated interswitching rate from the ground up by assessing the various input costs that railways face. They stated that they do not consider the commercial rate when determining the regulated rate. We also heard from producers that they understand that all parts of the chain, when it comes to transportation, need to be profitable, that everybody needs to succeed. And so I guess my question would be, how can the rate setting process be improved to provide the railways with sufficient return to investment in their infrastructure? Either one of you could answer.
David, do you want to start, or do you want me to take a shot at that?
I want you to take a shot at it.
Okay, you know what, in general, I think that ultimately, when you have market-based mechanisms allowing supply and demand to dictate the price, there will be a cost, there will be a return on invested capital, calculated in. When we have regulated rates entirely, we have to ensure that those regulated rates are compensatory. And, we made our recommendation that, for instance, interswitching rates, that the system in which they're set should be examined to ensure that they are compensatory. Because one of the things that we're not in the business of, I think, is government regulation forcing economic circumstance on a commercial entity that is not actually compensatory. And so from that perspective, we do want to incent the service providers within the chain to do that. That being said, there has to be certain checks and balances. This is why, we have to remember that even with the maximum revenue entitlement not being there, you still have things like final offer arbitration. You have, regulated rates. You have dispute resolution mechanisms of the agency. There are all kinds of mechanisms built in to, address the market imbalance that exists. So I think that, compensatory rate structure setting, and Kelly, the reason they can't consider the commercial rates in their determination is those are confidential. They don't actually have access to those rates because they're contractually confidential today. But I think that a cost and a reasonable return on invested capital for compensatory interswitching, and that to be excluded from a maximum revenue entitlement, if we want interswitching, the railways should not be penalized for doing it, and that may be to the benefit of producers.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Alcatib. Je cède maintenant pour 6 minutes la parole à
Monsieur Alcatib, Monsieur Fraser.
Sorry.
Transportation issues, and starting with marine transport. Being on the East Coast, one of the issues that's very important to me is sort of ports and the role that they play in getting goods to market. If the minister were to adopt an approach where he's say considering share capital structures, what would be the benefits to the port, and how might private investment enhance the ability of the Canadian transportation system to get goods to market?
On the East Coast, there is an issue of fragmentation. You've got too many ports, and they're all competing with each other. Nobody's got critical mass, and so I think government needs to focus on, and perhaps encourage institutional investors to focus on one or two ports with the associated rail and road linkages into the high-speed corridors that you need to really plug into. And so I don't want to presuppose the economics of investment in the Port of Halifax or the Port of St. John, for example, but I do think that private sector investment can be made attractive, and government doesn't have to put the billions in that is required to kickstart the port and make them more competitive. But I think a big piece of the puzzle has to be making hard decisions about which ports you're actually going to support, rather than continue to proliferate, a fair share for everybody.
Sure, and you mentioned Halifax and St. John, which are some of the largest on the East Coast. Do you think, as we go forward into the future, sort of the smaller communities that do have significant port infrastructure have a chance to continue to contribute?
In terms of national transportation policy, I would not. I wouldn't get too excited about the contribution they're going to make to the regional economy and the national economy. The transportation system, to be efficient, has to be big. It has to have fluidity. It needs to have volume. And you're in a just-in-time world where you need a constant flow, not a little bit here and a little bit there. That is just anathema to a good transportation system. There may be specific ports that have specific reasons to exist and thrive, but it may probably not be as part of a national transportation system.
In addition, still on marine transport, and I thank my colleague, Monsieur Aubin, for his questions about the Coast Guard. You mentioned icebreaker capacity and maybe some mapping. Are there other areas where you think integrating the Coast Guard into Transport Canada or pumping more resources into the Canadian Coast Guard would actually help expand trade?
I think there needs to be close collaboration and cooperation with the American Coast Guard. I think security in the north is a critical area for both the military and potentially the Coast Guard. There's tremendous investment in kind of the information software around navigation in the north. Mm-hmm. The sea bottom is only partially charted up there. Again, the Coast Guard can play a critically important role there. We also heard during our consultations that the building of vessels to equip the Coast Guard properly is costing, like $1 billion or $2 billion, and it's not going to be done for 10 years and so on. We heard testimony from people who said, well, why don't we lease vessels from the Danes or the Norwegians and so on? There are very cost-competitive ways of getting the kind of capacity we need for ice breaking and for performance of Coast Guard-related functions. Certainly. Without waiting for these long, awkward, expensive procurement programs to bear fruit.
And Mr. Chair, do I have a little extra time?
1 minute.
Thank you. That's hopefully all I need. One of the key priorities of this government is to make sure that we're not only promoting a safe, reliable, and efficient transportation system, but in everything that we do it in an environmentally responsible way as well. Where are the biggest opportunities in your mind for the government to improve the greening of our national transportation system?
Again, I think that any incentives that can be put in place to upgrade technology, whether it's in an aircraft or in trains, or upgrade the fluidity of the system, has, I think, a very positive environmental impact, because the more efficient the system is, the more smoothly it operates without bottlenecks and a lot of downtime and stop-start activity in the system, the more environmentally friendly it is per unit of GDP. And so I think investing in a really good, highly efficient system is probably, using the latest technology is the way to go.
Thank you kindly for your input.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Fraser. Je cède maintenant la parole à Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fraser. Mr. Robert Aubin, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for still being here, Mr. Emerson, still as ready, willing, and able. This is a huge report, and in reading it, I had a few questions, so I'm very glad you're here to enlighten me. There was a recommendation in the report which said that the that the maximum revenue entitlement program be modernized and eventually completely eliminated. That seemed a little contradictory. One, modernize it and then get rid of it. Can you enlighten us on this recommendation? One or the other.
David, I'll maybe start. The key thing on modernization is, many of your colleagues have been talking about the need for study and the need for informed action. We felt through the deliberations with the importance of the MRE to producers and to the agricultural industry that it be properly studied and that we test modernization initiatives on a gradual basis. So the foundational element was eliminate container intermodals, allow the railways to have a certain part of their fleets that would be available for auctions or premium services that would be excluded from that. The extra, tariffs would be excluded from the MRE, interswitching be excluded. So it was a gradual process. It allowed government to make those changes, test those changes, and ultimately react with either going back to a more regulated system or eventually to move towards a removal of the MRE. So we did advocate a gradual approach.
Political in the report, but we did think recommending immediate removal would be dead on arrival politically.
Dans un autre ordre d'idée, c'est le chapitre 11, je crois, qui...
I think Chapter 11 refers to the Transportation Agency, and you say that the agency is more reactive than proactive. You said that the review concluded that the agency does not have the relevant information it needs on transportation, and you recommended creating an integrated data platform and a dashboard on multimodal transportation. What type of data is actually lacking right now at the Transportation Agency? And if ever this platform was created, would it be accessible to the public? If so, why? And if not, why not?
Murad?
Okay, first of all, the agency itself doesn't have the power to obligate information to be collected. Today they can request it. They cannot go to either railways, industry, anyone to actually obligate them to provide data. That's one of the powers of the agency we think was very important. A cohesive system, we said clearly to the agricultural industry, be careful what you ask for. You're going to have obligations along with the railways and others to provide info. Everybody says they want to provide the info to allow policy and decision makers to have accurate, relevant data to be able to make decisions. We think that should be collected, by the agency or by an independent third party. That should be available to the public. It should be robust. It should be, tested in terms of relevance. And it should be an ongoing thing. Information is certainly power, both in policy, efficiency, and growth of the capacity of our system. This is a critical recommendation within the report.
The reactive as opposed to proactive comment in the report really refers to the fact that the agency is empowered to react to specific complaints. So if some shipper, for example, has a complaint about a treatment by a railway, and yet this is part of a pattern of behavior on the part of the railways or some systemic issue, the agency is not empowered to deal with that. They're only empowered to deal with the specific complaint by this specific complainant and the party that has caused the grievance. We're saying the agency should be empowered to get ahead of issues, to create systemic solutions, and have power, ex parte power, when a crisis evolves to issue orders that could create fixes that pertain to more than one shipper, for example.
And that's very similar to the Surface Transportation Board in the United States.
Merci. J'en conclus donc. J'ai encore une minute.
30 secondes.
Thank Thank you. Thank you. So I conclude that you are in favor of the agency having a proactive power of investigation. This would give us more strength or increased power. Thank you, Mr. Aubin. 6 minutes. Mr. Badaway.
Discussion because it's something that we've been discussing for the past few months, and in my thoughts, it results in outcomes that will be, quite frankly, a catalyst to a national economic strategy that takes advantages of the strengths that we have with respect to transportation. But on that point, Mr. Emerson, and I'm going to try and dig down toward a Canada transportation and logistics strategy, having to do with 1, process, 2, governance, and of course with that 3, investment. I happen to come from an area in the Niagara region that is a gateway. It's been designated as a provincial gateway center, and that being because of our geographic area through which significant incoming and outgoing transport flows and are distributed by means of transfer and transshipment. With that said, we are on a border. We are on the New York border, and as well, although international in scale, our hub requires a significant and associated amount of infrastructure. With that, it goes to my first question with respect to, you mentioned about it has to be big when you look at different areas of strength when it comes to these transportation-related infrastructure. Would you consider, especially in the border community, that part of that strength, part of that size is not just what is located in Canada, but it's all, in our case, in Niagara, what's also located in the United States. For example, the Continental One that's being currently established between Miami and Western New York, and of course then that flow of shipment coming through Canada.
Absolutely. One of the points of focus in the report was the importance of interoperability and to take a North American approach to the transportation system. There's a number of reasons for that. One, that's the biggest market. Number 2, a lot of the ability to have an efficient transportation system derives actually from Canada being attractively located so that traffic can flow through Canada onto the U.S. If all we had was Canada destined or Canada originating traffic, whether it's on the road or in the air, we would not have the critical mass to have an efficient transportation system. It would be far too lightly used, and we wouldn't have the gains and productivity opportunities that we have. And because transportation is a complete interlocking system, it's only as good as the weakest link. And if the weakest link is on the other side of the border, you better figure out how to fix.
Well, absolutely. And with that said, and you mentioned about money, you mentioned about the need for money and investment, and of course the participation of the private sector. Do you feel that to facilitate the fast and efficient movement of both goods and people in partnership with our biggest trading partner, what other mechanisms or enablers do you feel would also contribute to the infrastructure investments?
Well, one of the observations in the report, and there is a recommendation around it, is around if you're going to have a national transportation and logistics strategy, we have recommended that we do as the UK and Australia and some others do, which is to have a national critical projects list for transportation that should derive from the priorities of a national transportation strategy. Today, we don't have such a list. There is not at the moment a well-considered project list for transportation, much less a list of shovel-ready projects. And so we believe there needs to be a lot of work done to pull together a database on the existing infrastructure in Canada. What is its condition? Where are the critical fixes needed in the existing portfolio, if you like, of infrastructure? And then to assess where are the critical priorities to lay on new infrastructure and new projects, and to look at different ways of financing it. And we have recommended in the report that they enlist the advice of the institutional investment community to give them ideas on how you can de-risk in a way which allows government to take some risk out of it to avoid having to put up taxpayer dollars in their entirety and allow private sector investors to come in with a suitably long-term and responsible perspective.
And would you also agree with that said, that obviously it's going to result in economic clusters? With that, returns on those clusters that can be invested in infrastructure.
Yeah.
The second part of it is, would you agree that the supply and preservation of employment lands are needed to be guaranteed, so that therefore there are those growth areas with respect to those strengthened areas?
When you say employment lands, we have recommended as part of the preservation of critical gateways and corridors that industrial land for the purpose of supporting the transportation and logistics system be part of it, yes.
As well, my final question, in how much time?
20 seconds?
Okay, 20 seconds. One of the challenges that we have at the federal level, and sometimes at the municipal level, is that we want to create these economic clusters, infrastructure investments to go alongside and work in tandem with. We run into the provincial government having the jurisdictions over roads. So what recommendation would you give with respect to trying to create that cluster? We have the marine, we have the air, we have the rail, all of which we can participate in. Now we need that road. We need that expanded, new, or road that will connect, for example, to the Continental One in the United States. How do we then facilitate that?
Monsieur Emerson, probablement que
Mr. Emerson, Mr. R. Hardy will probably give you time to answer within his 6 minutes because the question was very long. Mr. Hardy.
With Mr. Badaway's answer.
Thanks, Ken.
Well, a quick answer is we have recommended that provinces be part of this national advisory council, if you like, on transportation and logistics. So they would be part of the deliberations around creating a national strategy and a national project priority list. Getting down to a more granular level, I come back to the money comment. I think federal infrastructure funding should be levered with provinces and municipalities and the private sector so that you get $5 for every dollar you put in.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ken.
And you get the priority recognized.
Great.
I think that the gateway projects in Metro Vancouver, particularly the Roberts Bank Rail Corridor, which my colleague Diane and I both were quite familiar with, is a good example of that, actually.
Yeah.
I wanted to take a much higher level view of things. In some of your earlier comments, you talked about transport being critical to the unity of the country, key foundation of government's economic policy. And in our country, because we don't have the huge free market infrastructure that they have in the United States, that inevitably forces the creation of a partnership between government and the free market. I sensed in your report that you think it's time for the pendulum to swing a little bit more toward the free market. I could be wrong there, but I guess the question becomes, in the context of what we're dealing with now in the country, if government and the free market are to be partners in this, what are the value adds that each bring?
I hope we didn't come across as being, aggressively wanting more free market, because in point of fact, I think various parts of the report call for a rebalancing to bring government's regulatory focus back into, albeit a very efficient interface with the transportation sector, but government needs to be empowered to do more. And if you really want to protect small shippers or passengers going on airlines from mistreatment because of power imbalance, the only way you're going to correct that power imbalance, in our judgment, is by having a more strongly empowered regulator that can get in between the grieving parties. And we also, I think, have been quite clear that the north and remote areas will not develop and will not have vibrant transportation infrastructure and therefore vibrant economies without a significant helping hand from government. The free market is not going to do it. And as much as I'm a free market economist, I think we've given a little too much credit to what free markets can actually do without a wise helping hand from government. It's the creation of the wise helping hand that's the challenge.
Right. And, you know, within the last 10 years, we've certainly seen some failures of the free market system. And we've seen the development or the growth of something called quarterly capitalism, which I was introduced to a short time ago. How do we square that? Obviously, because our two major railroads, for instance, or the airlines or the shipping companies will all be subject to those same pressures from their shareholders. How do we square that with the need, as Mr. Badaway inferred, for long-term, clear, concise, strategic planning and delivery of infrastructure?
Well, again, I really believe when you think about free markets, I urge you to not associate free markets necessarily with the stock market.
Yeah.
Okay, because stock markets are crazy and turbulent, and quarterly earnings and so on drive short-term thinking and decision-making. But I urge, and our report urges us to do a better job of harnessing the trillions of dollars that are in pension funds and institutional investment funds, where the investor has a long-term perspective because of the nature of their liabilities that they want to match their assets with, and so on. So I think that there are huge opportunities where Canadian pension funds today are investing all over the place. We just saw OMERS investing in the port of Melbourne, and Teachers' pension plan is invested in airports in the UK and in continental Europe, and so on and so forth.
Point taken.
They're not investing in Canada, which means either we don't get the investment or government's got to do it, and government doesn't have the money.
How do we get dead money back into circulation, he asks?
You sit down with some very smart people from the Department of Finance and Transportation Canada, and you find out from them how government can best play a role in creating an investment which long-term investors will invest in. And it's various risk mitigation measures. It's creating a contractual or a concession agreement that makes sense to a long-term investor. It's actually bringing the thinking of people who make a living from making long-term investments into your office and talking to them, and they'll tell you.
Do I have any time left?
No? Oh.
Well, rats.
I give you a few seconds more. Yeah. to understand the answer. Now, je vais laisser la parole maintenant à Madame Diane Watts.
Miss Deanne Watts for 6 minutes.
And just a couple of things, and I'll just continue along the line that Ken was on, in terms of leveraging the private sector in working together with government and incentivizing them to invest. I know that in British Columbia we've had some of those with the Portman Bridge and another few bridges that has not turned out really well because government is subsidizing them in the tune of, I don't know, 60 million a year. So I think in terms of leveraging money in that regard, we have to come up with better models. And I think they're out there. I just don't think we've gotten there yet. But I do want to ask a question. Now, we talked about marine transportation on the East Coast. Now I want to talk about it on the West Coast, and Kitimat, the LNG, all of those things. Now, I know that there's been some movement in terms of having no tankers up the coast at all. How is that going to impact the LNG? Is that dead now, or how do we look at that? Because I mean it's significant in terms of investment.
Our remit did not include pipelines, so let me just start there. Yep. However, my impression is, and this is not part of our report, my impression is the government of Canada is considering a ban on tanker traffic. My understanding was that it was focused on oil, not gas. But I could be wrong. Anyway, if there is a ban on both, then clearly you've narrowed your options for access to tidewater drastically to probably running it through a twinning of the Trans Mountain Line through Vancouver.
Right, which I think that's not going to, and I think this is probably part of the problem that we have in British Columbia, because, you know, the twinning of that line is under discussion right now, and I think that's probably not going to go ahead. The any of the tankers that would carry gas is not going to go ahead. So how, in terms of looking at those economic corridors, looking at the viability of moving the economy forward, how do we deal with that? Because we've got communities all the way up the coast, especially with the LNG, and there's opportunities there to get into the world market.
As I say, this was not a central part of the study. We backed into oil because the lack of pipeline capacity has led to some real escalation in oil by rail, and that has its own implications. It's less economic, it's less environmentally friendly, it's less safe. And so while pipelines may not be very popular, the implications of the same volume going by rail I think are probably much darker. Mm-hmm. And I would also make the point that Canada today, people don't realize, they're only just starting to realize how dependent Canada has become on the extended energy sector and all of the sectors that actually feed off of the energy sector. And the energy sector is almost exclusively dependent on using U.S. tidewater capacity, which means ultimately Donald Trump can control your exports of oil, for example. Mm-hmm. And I think, as a Canadian, I think that's a very dangerous position to be in.
Right. Okay. And I want to, I think I've just got a little bit more time here. Also, too, in terms of setting up the governance structure. Now, and we talked a little bit about that before in terms of making sure that those corridors are viable, making sure that there's a massing in terms of and clustering when you're looking at those corridors. Is there any analysis that has been done in terms of, because I know you've worked on the Asia Pacific and all of the elements required for that. Now, is that model one that you could replicate through in other areas, or is that something that would have to be, because the elements would have to be there, of course, but could you use that model in other areas elsewhere?
Other parts of the country, you mean?
And I'm thinking just particularly when it was asked about the East Coast, when you're looking at massing and there's too many ports, how does that look? Can you take part of that model and move it over?
You could, but the elephant in the room is nobody wants to agree that Halifax should be, let's say, the container port for the East Coast, the primary container port, and let's say St. John becomes the bulk and energy port. There seems to be an ongoing inability to agree where the focus of investment and a strategy should be. And I know that I think it was the previous government tried to kickstart a gateway strategy for Atlantic Canada. Mm-hmm. Our understanding was it really didn't go very far because there was a lack of consensus within Atlantic Canada. To do it right, you actually have to consolidate and focus. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've done on the West Coast. We got a lot of resistance along the way, but It was done.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Watts. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Emerson.
Thank you, Ms. Watson. Mr. Emerson. 6 minutes, again, for Mr. Iacono. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Honorable Mr. Emerson, one of our export markets is something I'd like to talk about. Those who believe that Western transportation is, or rather, it's the West versus the St. Lawrence. How can you make the Western corridor more attractive in the current context?
Sure, what your question is. You mean make Western products flow through the Eastern corridor?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, a key thing, as Murad has alluded to, is ice breaking on the Great Lakes, and the St. Lawrence Seaway has limited capacity in terms of big, competitive ocean-going shipping these days. The ships are getting so much bigger. My own view is that over multiple decades, the rail links to ports like Montreal can sustain an increase in shipping and eventually an increase in product flow through the St. Lawrence. My guess is to do it through the Great Lakes for the long haul is probably not going to happen. There may be an increase in short sea shipping and some modest increase on the lakes, but having a supply chain that is not 24/7, 365 days of the year is really not going to be competitive in the global economy going forward. And so you've got to have those ground rail links right from the west to Tidewater in Quebec or Atlantic Canada.
Now, Mr. Emerson, if I could add a point, our trade lanes are also changing in Canada. When we look at the Asia-Pacific Gateway, we had a lot of focus, of course, and we continue to have on China. But with the growth in our agricultural exports to India, we have a number of our products now going to India via the East Coast, via Montreal. And so the steamship lines, in particular on the container side, are shipping out of Europe via the Suez Canal to hit India on a transit time that's actually, very, very efficient. And so I think that the growth and the priority that we have, both on growing our trade with countries like Turkey, North Africa, India, and of course the CETA, the Canada-Europe Trade Agreement, is going to make that Eastern Gateway very, very important for us, going forward. And containerized shipping out of Montreal, looking at also Great Lakes and Quebec, Seaway port access is certainly a priority for our company and for others in the industry.
Thank you.
Monsieur Fraser?
Yeah, thanks very much. I just had a quick question about the role of small airports. I think there's maybe 6 or so key small airports, and they skew towards the Atlantic region that don't currently have access to federal infrastructure money. I'm curious as to what your thoughts may be on federal investments in these smaller airports as part of the larger national transportation system in order to grow the Canadian economy.
In the report, we have emphasized the importance of the small airports capital fund, or whatever it's called. There is a fund in Transport Canada for investing in small airports, and we have recommended a significant increase in those funds. Our priority would have been more remote communities, because in a lot of southern Canada, if I can call it that, you tend to get a proliferation of small airports, which starts to run into issues as to, how viable is it to have, for example, in BC, you've got Kelowna, Penticton, Kamloops, all have their own little airport. We're all trying to feed in an efficient way into YVR to get onto a main line. And I know in Atlantic Canada you have a similar situation, and I hate to be hard-hearted about it, but I think the Government of Canada has to make some choices where they put the investments.
Mr. Chair, I think we're probably close to the end of the time. I believe Mr. Sakan had a quick question.
It's your round, so you just decide.
Seeing as international trade is so important to our GDP, I just wanted to get your opinion on foreign ownership of our transportation system or in general.
Our recommendations in the report were in the air sector, for example, to increase the foreign ownership limit from 25 up to 49%. That's not different than the Wilson report back in 2008. The restrictions on foreign ownership are particularly onerous for startup carriers. We've noted in the report that Canada has not really had a ultra low cost carrier, and what we heard from our consultations is a ultra low cost carrier to start up in Canada needs to get financing, and it's very difficult to get enough financing if you're not a publicly traded company in Canada to start a low cost carrier. So we've said, we really need to allow these startups access to foreign capital to make sure that over time Canada does get a more competitive air sector through the ultra low cost route.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Emerson. Je dois maintenant céder.
Thank you, Mr. Emerson. I'll now give the floor to Ms. Kelly Block for 5 minutes.
I have is in follow-up to the one you just answered, as well as a comment that Mr. Hardy made in terms of how to get capital funding moving in Canada. And as was just noted, European investors want to come to Canada to invest in a new airline, but this government is blocking their entry. And your report recommends raising the foreign ownership threshold to 49%, and one can imagine that after 18 months of going across the country and putting time and effort into the study that you've done, you understand, and in making the recommendation that makes sense. What signal does government send when they to foreign investors and capital when they take so long to make a decision that is time sensitive like this?
Well, it's not that different from the time it takes to get major project decisions, which in Canada is starting to be clocked in decades now instead of months and years. So I think we've got a major problem nationally in terms of attracting major investments, recognizing that private sector companies, when they embark on a plan to make an investment and seek an approval, they actually have to tie up their balance sheet, sometimes with billions of dollars of committed money, not knowing when or whether they're going to get an approval to do it. And so, it's an issue that does not call for less diligence. It just calls for a more efficient, more robust and rigorous process to get from start to finish on the process. I want to make one further comment before I leave you as well. Canada's been gradually opening up air service agreements with other countries and other air carriers, but we're not doing it fast enough. And I look at a good example, and Diane will relate to this. Emirates Air has wanted to increase their frequencies into Canada. We've rejected them as a country. And there's bad blood now with the carriers and the country as a result of that decision. But what has happened is now Emirates is hubbing out of Seattle. And so you've got Air Canada and WestJet are flying people by the droves down to Seattle to get on an Emirates flight so they can go and gateway through Dubai. I mean, it's total craziness. And it's happening elsewhere. We can shut the door to these increases in air services, but the traveling public is going to find a way, and these carriers are going to find a way to have the traveling public accommodated. So we need to, in our air service agreements, become much more attuned to the needs of the Canadian economy and the Canadian consumer, and a little less afraid of our dominant domestic carriers. They should be part of the puzzle, but they shouldn't be driving the train or the plane.
Thank you. One could well imagine that, as I've said, an 18-month study, the analysis that your panel did on this very issue might be enough, given the fact that we are now 10 months, I think it's since the report was made public, almost a year to the time that the government was given the report, and so I'm not sure what other analysis is needing to take place in order to approve this request by Jetlines. But the CEO of Jetlines has said that unless an exemption order is granted and a clear timeline provided by the minister in the coming weeks, the opportunity will simply be lost. And I think that's something that you've made your point very well. I want to go back to the MRE, and I want to ask a question in follow-up to some of the comments that were made by Mr. Khatib. How much do you think grain shipping rates would increase if the MRE was removed?
Murad, can you?
Well, without, I guess the only thing that I can say is that, without a much bigger study on that, I can't give you an exact number. If we do look at grain rates today, per revenue mile, they are lagging behind other commodities. And, I think that the figure is, somewhere in the range of 12 to 17% lagging. Behind other rates. But, I think that ultimately, we cannot assume that the MRE comes off and automatically rates go up that 17%. I think that, efficient commercial operations, will grant an ability of, shippers to negotiate. I mean, the potash industry, of which, you're very familiar being from Saskatchewan, is actually an industry that we recognized in the report as having probably a model-based, a model of true efficiency in terms of infrastructure that's been set up and, infrastructure that, has been well suited to rail movements. Very close or maybe even within your constituency at Delisle, Saskatchewan, we're AGT Foods, our company, we're currently building a rail consolidation center to be able to take traffic from your constituency into a consolidation center, build very long unit trains, and move into the Port of Prince Rupert and into Thunder Bay, with Canadian National Railway. So efficient, collaborative infrastructure moves can help to offset some of that cost uncertainty that may come from an MRE change. That being said,
Monsieur,
we were very clear.
Je dois vous interrompre.
I apologize, sir. I have to interrupt you because your time is up. Mr. Aubin. Thank you. I will try to complete the cycle and come back to a more general question, because if you look at the report and the number of recommendations, you might end up feeling pessimistic. So I have a multiple choice question for you. If you had to characterize Canada's model, are we in the top 3, top 5, top 10, or do we not make the rankings at all? Sub-question, which country should be a model for Canada if we are not a world leader in this area?
Rankings of Canada's place in terms of transportation and logistics, and we've actually fallen. I don't remember the precise ranking, but I think we've fallen somewhere from 14 to 16 in the world in terms of the quality of our transportation system and infrastructure, but don't quote me on it. It's in the report. I actually think Australia and the UK are doing a pretty good job, certainly in terms of having a national transportation strategy, having a national projects pipeline, and a system for attracting private investment and institutional investment into their transportation system. We've got mature assets like some of our airports, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. Those airports are worth billions of dollars. And at the moment, the governance structure is a kind of a community authority, doesn't use government money, but they have unlimited power to basically levy an airport improvement fee on passengers. The public has no say on the matter. And basically, they're not governed by the CTA. And frankly, I think that private institutional investors would put billions into the hands of government that could then be invested in other infrastructure that we don't have, and allow those facilities to be run under a regulated private sector model, and you'd have a more disciplined governance arrangement in terms of better clarity in terms of allocation of capital at these airports and so on.
Merci. Est-ce que vous souhaitez ajouter?
Thank you. Would you like to add anything, Mr. Al-Khatib, in 15 seconds?
Australia and other places, harsh climate, big geography. I think we're doing very, very well as a country.
Thank you.
Bravo pour vos 15 secondes, Monsieur Al-Khatib.
Thank you for respecting those 15 seconds. That was a great, quick answer. Now, time is moving forward. Perhaps we can have a last 2-minute round for each party, if you agree with that. Last 2-minute question for Mr. Emerson. Ms. Block.
Chair, and I want to actually go back to a couple of comments made by each of you. The first being by Mr. Emerson that a remandated CTA is extremely important, and Mr. Khatib, you observed that the CTA functions in a reactive way, and I'm wondering if either of you could comment on a practical level. How would the CTA determine which cases to investigate or the work that they do unless they were reacting to issues that arise within the system?
I'll give you a quick answer.
I think that, the level of reaction we're talking about is today an actual complaint has to trigger the investigation. So, I think that, once you start to get interactions and you have the ability to investigate ex parte, you can identify systemic issues, tackle them before they get to a problem where we were in 2013. Very, very quickly, you asked the question earlier, was 2013 a failure or was it extraordinary circumstances? I think it was extraordinary circumstances. Huge crop, bad weather. I think we recovered relatively well.
And I would just say that a remandated CTA would have a much more comprehensive capacity and an information base to understand the workings of the system and identify problems and bottlenecks before they become a crisis.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, je vais parole à M.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy.
So we have this inequity between grain producers and other commodities in terms of things like interswitching and maximum revenue entitlement. I sense that you would rather see the grain producers move to the same level playing field as the other commodities and not the other way around. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, good. Other quick question. St. Lawrence Seaway, it was a transport corridor that received an awful lot of attention back in the 50s and into the 60s. Is it time that we had a good look at that and expanded it? Is the market there, is the rationale there to do that?
I think when you have the option of improving rail linkages to tidewater on the East Coast or in the St. Lawrence, the likelihood that you're going to solve your ice breaking and scale problems in the seaway anytime soon and in an affordable way is pretty low. I think you can improve it as a niche part of the system, but I think that there are better investments in terms of the long-term high-velocity, high-speed corridors. Murad might have a different view on that.
I think that the seaway is a very important element that we should be looking at it, definitely moving, short sea shipping, still very cost effective. I think that we should look at both. The high velocity corridor takes a lot of money and a lot of time. I think there's improvements in the seaway that can be done fairly immediately, and it will have a big impact.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Aubin.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I feel I'm concluding again. Very brief question. You earlier clearly demonstrated that it would be possible to receive international funding for our airports by increasing the cap. Do you think it would also be possible to attract international investment in our rail service, including passenger service and marine transportation?
Benefiting from access to foreign capital through public markets. So the question would really be around passenger rail, and I think, yes, there is a possibility there. I should emphasize that there is a huge amount of Canadian long-term capital that would like to deploy in Canada and in Canadian investments. And so we shouldn't just think of opening up to more private investment as a foreign investment exercise. There's a lot of Canadian institutional money looking for a home in Canada, but there are no vehicles to invest in, so they're putting it elsewhere.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup, M. Aubin. M. Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Aubin. Mr. Harvey, I don't know if you were paying me a compliment. I'm not quite sure who Mr. Trebek is, since I watch French TV, so it's harder for me to know what you were saying. If it was a compliment, thank you. And if not, well, I'll get back to you. Well, that's it, Mr. Emerson. Thank you so much for being here, and Mr. Al-Khatib as well. On behalf of all of my colleagues, I believe we appreciated the quality of the responses you gave to our questions, and they will definitely help us in our work. Congratulations once again to yourself and your team for the report, which we have all read with great interest. Thank you so much. Would you like to say a few final words?
For inviting me and showing the interest and dedication that you're showing. And I want to thank Murad Al-Khatib for getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, whatever you did, Murad, to participate. And so thank you very kindly.
Merci beaucoup, M. Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Emerson. Ms. Block?
I recognize that this portion of our meeting is over, but didn't want you to adjourn before I was able to ask a question about next week's meetings, what is on the schedule for next week's meetings. Want to also register my concern that the committee hasn't met to discuss what's coming up on the agenda, and would like to ask that perhaps Thursday, which I understand no witnesses have been scheduled, that we could perhaps set that aside for a committee meeting to discuss committee business.
Monsieur Badaway?
Yeah, I do respect the comments by Ms. Block with respect. I'm sure she's referring to the Navigable Waters discussion that we're going to be having, and or moving forward with some direction with respect to the committee's next meetings and of course the agenda set within the same. We're having a meeting on Monday with the steering committee, and I believe that's what that meeting is actually for, is to set that agenda. And of course, with that, we don't have to take any time away from the meetings that we have scheduled both on Tuesday and Thursday.
Madame, j'ai présentement une demande de prolonger. Monsieur Badaway nous dit qu'on n'a pas besoin de prolonger.
I have a request to extend. Mr. Badaway says we don't need to extend the meetings. So what is the will of the committee? Would you like us to adjourn now or extend for a few more minutes?
Ceux et celles qui veulent qu'on poursuive la rencontre pour...
No strong opinions. Who would like to talk about what we should look at next week? Please raise your hands.
Clarify that certainly the subcommittee is, if they meet to put forward any kind of recommendation to the whole committee in terms of what the schedule is going to look like for the fall session, that would be my understanding. I think since we don't have witnesses scheduled for Thursday yet, we may want to schedule some time for the subcommittee to report to the whole committee so that we can actually confirm what the session is going to look like, not particular to any one study, but the entire fall session.
Donc, j'ai compris la demande.
I've understood Ms. Block's request, and it seems that she would like us to take time at the next meeting of the full committee to discuss the fall agenda. perhaps the subcommittee on Monday could be seized of that issue, and then we can deal with it then. Mr. Badaway?
I have a problem with that, per se, and what I mean by that is that we have a 2-hour allocation for our meetings. If we can do it as a part of an extension to that meeting, I don't have a problem with that. But as part of that meeting within that 2-hour allocation, I do have a problem simply because we're going to be discussing these very issues that we discussed this afternoon or this morning with the Transportation Act review, and I'm very hard pressed to take away from that discussion. So I would ask that the committee, if in fact Ms. Block wants to go in that direction, which I don't have a problem with, we can do it beyond the 2-hour allocation, so that therefore we don't take away from the discussion with respect to the Canada Transportation Act review.
Madame Bloch,
So I think something that's being ignored is the fact that typically committees do meet at the beginning of a session to talk about the agenda, that all members of the committee have an opportunity to provide input to what a committee is going to study. Typically, you might schedule a meeting for the committee at the beginning of a session to talk about what's going to be on the agenda and what they would like to see take place. So we've launched into this study without any discussion by the committee around the fall session. We had many conversations in the last session. There are a number of motions on the floor, and so I think it behooves us to take the best time at the beginning of the session to talk about it as a committee. So while I recognize that we are now in a study, the committee didn't talk about the fall agenda, which normally is what would happen.
Monsieur Badaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think for the most part we did talk about the agenda back in the spring, and we passed the agenda except for the one issue with nav waters. Again, I don't have a problem discussing it at the first part of this session. I have no qualms about that, just as long as we don't take away from the current work that we already have agreed upon. That being rail on Tuesday, and of course the review of the Transportation Act on Thursday. My recommendation, Mr. Chairman, once again, and not to be repetitive, is to in fact look at extending the meeting, whether it be the Tuesday meeting or the Thursday meeting, with whatever time that we feel appropriate to discuss the issues that are going to be coming out of the steering committee on Monday.
On a une proposition d'allonger le prochain meeting. Est-ce que...
So it's been proposed that we extend the upcoming meeting. Any feedback on that, Ms. Bloch?
And we developed a habit of extending our meetings in order to accommodate a fairly aggressive agenda. And I'm not opposed to extending meetings for that purpose. If the governing members are not willing to schedule a time during committee, our allotted time for committee, to have a conversation with members of the opposition to actually determine what the fall session is going to look like, regardless of whether or not we talked about extending a study on interswitching, for example, on the provisions that were being sunsetted in C30. Yes, we agreed to do that. Those, we put that extension in place to August 1st of 2017. We said we would report back by that time. So there was an agreement to do this study, but we didn't sit down and say it's going to happen at the very beginning of the session, and we're going to take this many meetings to do it, and then we're going to launch into another study. And I think it's a sign of disrespect to members of the opposition not to plan to have that conversation at a beginning of the session. And while you say you're reluctant to do that unless we extend the meetings, I think there's an expectation that should be one of the first things that happens during a committee meeting at the beginning of a session.
Vous voulez la parole, M. Badaway, ou c'est terminé?
Mr. Badaway, would you like to respond?
Monsieur Aubin?
Je crois.
I arrived last. I was not here last fall and spring when these discussions took place, but it seems to me that extending our meetings should be the exception rather than the rule, because we're all very busy. And to extend a meeting means that we have to cut our work elsewhere. Furthermore, the subcommittee is going to meet on Monday, and that is also going to take up time. That committee will have to produce a report. So I think it's quite logical that at the beginning of a session, we take the time to altogether look at our fall schedule and that we discuss this during regular meeting hours. Thank you very much, Mr. Aube. Mr. Badaway.
And with all due respect for both opposition parties, or opposition party as well as the NDP, we do have a meeting on Tuesday, and we are going to be discussing what they are on the agenda. And if, in fact, there is opportunity, which I suspect there will be, to discuss this issue, we can make it as first part of the discussion on the Tuesday meeting.
Block.
Excuse me.
Recognize we have witnesses scheduled for Tuesday, and I'm not asking to take time away from those witnesses or to change what we have scheduled on Tuesday. Happy to go forward with what is on the plan already. My understanding is there were no witnesses yet scheduled for Thursday, which is why I asked for some time on Thursday to be set aside for a discussion of the whole committee on the agenda going forward.
Monsieur Hardy, après ça, Monsieur Badaway.
Perhaps an option is to take the subcommittee time and make it a committee of the whole. Everybody there and have the discussion.
Monsieur Badaway.
We're trying to be accommodating here, and while at the same time trying not to take away from the agendas that have already been established. And we have 3 meetings set up. We have a steering committee set up on Monday. We have then the committee of the whole on Tuesday, and we have one on Thursday. If, in fact, and I'm sure that it'll be a very robust discussion on Monday with respect to the steering committee and how we're going to move forward with committee. Having said that, on Tuesday and Thursday, if and when those issues are brought up that come out of the steering committee meeting, we can discuss them then. Whether it's Tuesday or Thursday, we can start off with a Tuesday discussion based on time, and if it then flows into the Thursday meeting, then so be it.
Terminé. Donc,
So if I understand, the opposition is requesting that we take some time from next Thursday's meeting to discuss our agenda for this fall. Ms. Block made this request, and that the subcommittee meet on Monday. Tuesday, we are hearing from witnesses. I've confirmed this with the clerk. And Thursday, we do not have any witnesses yet. So, is it the will of the committee to follow up on Ms. Block's request to spend some time on Thursday to discuss our agenda? That's my question to all of you, and it would be good if we could settle it. Is it the will of the committee to set aside time during Thursday's meeting to discuss our fall agenda?
Donc, s'il n'y a pas d'intervention, je vais demander...
Can you
je vais répéter tranquillement.
I'll repeat slowly. The opposition has made a proposal that we set aside time next week to talk about our fall session. Tuesday, we already have witnesses. So the opposition is not asking to change Tuesday's agenda. But on Thursday, there are no witnesses yet. So on Thursday, we could discuss our fall agenda. And we can also talk about the report of the subcommittee, which will meet on Monday. So I propose that we set aside 1 hour on Thursday to talk about our fall agenda. That way we can all agree on how we want to move forward as a committee.
And I can't agree to that, because the fact of the matter is we have, again, a pretty aggressive agenda that we're proceeding with on Tuesday and Thursday, already scheduled, as Ms. Block has already identified. Tuesday we have witnesses, and Thursday we're going to be dealing with the issues that we discussed today. And may I suggest, again, and again, not to be repetitive, and with all due respect, that we, in fact, roll into Tuesday's meeting based on the 2 hours we're going to spend on Monday dealing with this issue. And then with that, and there's no reason why other members can't show up to Monday's meeting, the steering committee meeting, to discuss the issue. On Tuesday, we can then discuss it in standing committee, albeit we may not have all that much time because we do have witnesses scheduled. We can play it by ear on Tuesday to see how much time it'll run into, and then, of course, we can finish off on Thursday. But to actually formally dedicate Thursday 1 hour for this issue, I can't support that personally.
Donc, la proposition est rejetée.
So the proposal has been rejected by the government side. Mr. Aubé, a final intervention. I just want to make sure I understood Mr. Badaway when he said he cannot spend all of Thursday's meeting to this discussion, which we would like to have. We were not asking to spend the entire Thursday meeting on this, perhaps half of the meeting, which would allow us to hear a witness for 1 hour. Ms. Block?
What the members on the other side of the table are failing to recognize is that any report coming from the subcommittee has to be ratified by the whole committee. So any decisions that come out of the subcommittee must be ratified by this committee. Therefore, I'm suggesting that you provide us time to hear what the report of the subcommittee is and to make decisions based on any recommendations that would come out of that subcommittee meeting. That is, to me, the process that all committees function by. So I'm at a loss for why members of the governing party aren't recognizing the due process that a committee goes through in terms of setting their agenda.
Madame Watts?
Well, I just think it's, whether we find the time on Tuesday or Thursday, I think the fact of the matter is that we just need to talk about the agenda. I think there was time frames that were laid out, there was additional things added that we were unaware of, and a simple conversation would rectify moving forward, and if there's that much time that needs to be allocated, so we need to have a conversation at some point.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Badaway?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll move to adjourn.
On a une proposition pour...
It has been moved that we adjourn our meeting. In agreement? Well, the meeting has been adjourned.